Hello, everybody, and welcome to the very first live stream Q&A at African Elements. My name is Darius Spearman, and I'm a professor of Black Studies at City College, and I've taught Black Studies for over 20 years now. I want to welcome all of our viewers and thank our subscribers and to our Patreon support for supporting our efforts to make Black Studies classroom content accessible to the masses where it should be. African Elements doesn't believe that higher education should be only accessible to those people who meet some sort of arbitrary admissions criteria for higher education, or by people who have the ability to create fake profiles, Dr. scores for their kids. So we want to encourage those folks who are grinding, teaching 3 and 4 and 5 different campuses to stay in the discipline, because it's hard to stay in the discipline when you don't know from semester to semester whether or not you're going to be offered a teaching assignment. So we're hoping to ease that burden a little bit by offering folks a chance to shine, hopefully to pick up some of the slack, keeping them gainfully working within the discipline. So that's why we've enabled super chats today for today's discussion. If you have a question you want answered, you can post it to our super chat and contribute as much as you'd like or as little as $1, and we will answer it live on the air. So our goal is $75, which is about what an instructor gets paid per lecture. So if 75 of you post as little as $1, we can help some really talented folks stay in the discipline and get paid for their work. So, speaking of very talented folks, we have joining us today Dr. Matsemela Odom. Dr. Odom is a professor of Black Studies who's taught at San Diego Community College District, in addition to Palomar College, as well as San Diego State University, University of San Diego, UC San Diego. He earned his doctoral degree from UC San Diego in 2007 with the completion of his doctoral dissertation from Southern California to Southern Africa. Black internationalism, Los Angeles and San Diego, civil rights to apartheid, 1964. I've known Dr. Odom for a long time, and I can say he's truly a people scholar right along trying to do here at African Elements, making education accessible to the masses, and he's dedicated much of his time to bringing classroom education to the people, conducting free political education classes at Pillars of the Community here in San Diego. He's also an officer at the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement, or IMPEDUM, where he does bi-weekly political discussions on selected articles from the Burning Spear newspaper. It's called the Burning Spear Reading Group on Facebook. And one of those discussions is actually going to be happening tomorrow. I've personally taken part in some of those discussions, and I can tell you those discussions are on fire. So you can look that up in our Facebook group, and I'll also put the link in the description below. So, Dr. Odom, thank you so much for coming on. Um, and so uh, we are talking about we're talking about we're talking about African internationalism, Malcolm X and African internationalism. But can you briefly explain to the viewers what African internationalism is and how that fits within Malcolm X's framework of human rights versus civil rights?
All right, so yeah, first and foremost, it's important to note about African internationalism that African internationalism is an anti-colonial ideology. It, it understands that the oppression that African people in the U.S. and internationally face is a result of capitalism and what we call parasitic capitalism, and as well as colonialism's and imperialism's assault on Africa and African people internationally. Oftentimes, there's a sort of an insistence or willingness to say whether this down to understanding of racism or things like that. But instead of elevating our analysis to a higher degree, we understand that that's merely, say, an ideological construct, but the material basis behind the oppression that African people face is African international. I mean, sorry, is colonialism. And this is without a doubt in line with the ideas of Malcolm X, as well as other people like Kwame Nkrumah, Marcus Garvey, and others. So African internationalism is a theory. It's a socialist theory developed by Chairman Omali Yeshitela of the African People's Socialist Party. So I'd like to begin by actually saluting Chairman Omali Yeshitela of the African People's Socialist Party, as well as President Kalambayi Andanet. She's the president of the International People's Democratic Movement, my leadership. So African internationalism is the guiding theory of the movement, but it's also, like I said, it's a theory crafted for almost 50 years by Chairman Omali Yeshitela. It's understood as a theory that explains the world as a place, as the place and future of Africans in it, right? African internationalists recognize that capitalism is born as a world economy and has its origins in the assault on Africa and the global trade of African people. Um, uh, uh, so, so we see here. So the other thing is that it really explains that uh, there aren't any real like it's not it's not idealist, it's not a mystical ideology which suggests that we don't know or sort of some man behind the curtain has his hands on the lever. It suggests that everything in the world is knowable and the African place in the world is knowable as well. So that is and that it's changeable, right? African internationalism seeks to have unified Africa, free of colonialism, and eventually under a socialist government led by the African working class. So that's what really sets it apart from other ideas. This exalting of the struggles of the African working class, and that's why, in many ways, Malcolm X is one of the truest of African internationalists out there. Lastly, it's also a an idea. Also, it is of the product of dialectical materialism. So those are a lot of big words and things like that. Hopefully, the people out there can go and
Yeah, can you break that down?
look them up.
What dialectical materialism is?
Well, yeah. In short, basically, it's the unity of opposites. It's the idea that you can study competing and sometimes even contradictory ideas to find actual truth. And yeah, so it really just yeah, yeah. It's they've got a whole culture, especially in social media, where people go about finding their way of the world nowadays um, by only researching things that they agree with. Dialectical materialists don't do that. You take in as much as information as possible and try to understand, your place in the world and how to change it. I mean, that is what Malcolm did, right? I mean, when you listen to say "Message to the Grassroots," "The Ballad of the Bullet," or whatever one of his speeches that still afloat around, Malcolm talks about the way in which even when he was incarcerated or before he was incarcerated and afterwards he was an avid reader. He learned about the world. He sort of learned about the Africans' place in the world, and then history therefore became not just a feel good, touchy subject, but history became a material struggle through which he sought to learn things about the past. Um, yeah, so it became a material struggle through which he sought to learn things about the past so that he could place those things into action. Malcolm X ran what was called the the University of Islam. It was a training center for the ministers, but also K through 12 school for youth as well. And in it, Malcolm X talks about how he used to run what was called He said that he would teach his students about, say, Hannibal Barca, uh, the Carthaginian general, or um, Menelik II, who defeated the Italians in battle in Ethiopia in 1896. And the point he said was that the reason why he taught that stuff was so that African children nowadays can know that they too can defeat outside colonial oppressors, right? So it's really a different way of thinking about history, right? Not just say that, like, it can make you feel good, but that history in itself had a social scientific aspect to it through which you can learn and then apply that stuff to the changing of the world.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's African internationalism.
Wow. Lots to unpack. I love that you talked about theory, because you and I are both educators, and um, both kind of understand, especially coming from a Black studies perspective, that education isn't just the giving people a lot of information, but teaching them, educating people on how to learn, right? And you can't really do that without theory. One example is, as I was reading today, I was thinking about Alex Haley's kind of version of Malcolm X's story, and if you don't have a sort of a theoretical framework, you might come away from that with the impression that his trip to Mecca was, represented his departure from the teaching of Elijah Muhammad and turning towards the quote unquote true ethnic faith, the religious faith of Islam, and a rejection of the sort of doctrine of Elijah Muhammad. With the theoretical framework, you kind of, at least I kind of understand that that was his narrative, but it was more or less Malcolm sort of jumping into the deep end in terms of his internationalism. He didn't just go to Saudi Arabia. He met with Kwame Nkrumah. He met with various folks who were in the thick of the anti-colonial struggle. So and he brought that theoretical framework back with him in the form of the OAAU, which was sort of patterned after the Organization of African Unity, Kwame Nkrumah, which in turn was sort of inspired by the Bandung Conference in Indonesia. I think Nkrumah attended that conference. Not mis- no, there were some folks in the African struggle, anti-colonial struggle, who attended. I think he was there, if I'm not mistaken. But this is all about collecting a framework for an international anti-colonial struggle that Malcolm X was putting into this and bringing it back to the States. So how am I right about that? And how does that framework translate into this notion of civil rights versus human rights, taking the struggle to an international level?
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of things have come out about Alex Haley even until now. I mean, I learned it through reading, but also through looking at, some of your lectures. The idea that Alex Haley, I guess he was like working as an informant for the government or something like that. But I think also the thing that stands out to me about Haley is that, Haley was a Republican. He was, at best, a black moderate who sought to, I mean, through interviewing Malcolm, like most people, he gained a much more humanistic understanding of Malcolm, and that Malcolm wasn't, you know, what everyone had promoted. Because, like, in 1959, they had a documentary that was called "The Hate That Hate Produced,"
Right.
right? So, in this documentary, "The Hate That Hate Produced," you basically um, got this perspective. Well, that like white liberals and even some black liberals basically were using the Nation of Islam as an example for why the rest of white America should embrace the much more respectable, acceptable
Hmm.
aspects of the civil rights movement, right? So, like, but the problem was that um, the documentary kind of backfired, right? So for the first time, a lot of black people who never heard of Nation of Islam had heard of the Nation of Islam, and they liked what they saw. They saw people standing up. They saw Malcolm, and they saw him and others standing up to white power. So between like 1959 and 1963, you really see a rapid increase in black radical activism. But I kind of see Alex Haley's expose kind of in that lens, right? I mean, he was trying to show people that hey, he's not this hate monger. He's like he's reformed, and the more sort of devious part is because Alex Haley's autobiography has been incorporated into the AP U.S. history curriculum. That's generally, if you ask people about Malcolm X, they'll say two things. They'll say he's a civil rights leader, and they'll say that he used to hate white people, but then he learned
Right.
that all people were equal, and once he went to what's him call it, right? I mean, it's like people never actually even read his autobiography, right? I mean, he started off as a kid going to a multiracial, sort of multinational school, multiracial school with white people, and then he was told that he couldn't be all that he wanted to be, so Malcolm ran. Malcolm's father was killed. His mother was driven insane by what they experienced. So, and his opposition to that, his opposition to white power landed him in prison. So Malcolm has struggled against white power. I mean, at the very least, you can tell even when he's younger, Malcolm understands that uh, what people call racism really is like a much more larger material structure, a material force. So yeah. So I think that the Alex Haley narrative, even though it's the way through which most of us first hear about Malcolm, and then Spike Lee's movie as well, kind of doubles down on some of that stuff. Um, uh, we end up I would say that we end up like I said, really buying into that sort of narrative instead of understanding Malcolm, the revolutionary, the anti-colonial fighter, and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, Malcolm himself said that he wasn't about civil rights, but it was about a struggle for human rights, right? In his struggle for human rights, he had intended to take the struggle of African people in the U.S. To the world stage by charging genocide and bringing the genocide of African people in the U.S. to the world stage, to the international courts and things like that. And it's around that time that he was assassinated.
Hmm. And so what's your assessment of uh, African internationalism, especially taking it to that global stage? Um, I- Clearly he was trying to create solidarity with anti-colonial struggle, the OAA. I can't remember. I know he met with Fidel Castro. I can't remember if that was before or after pilgrimage.
Well,
It
it's
was.
two things, really. So like 19. So first off, like when he went on his Hajj in '63, early '64, or whenever, that wasn't the first time he had visited the Middle East,
Mhm.
right? So he'd been there in the late '50s. Um, he'd actually gone there, and because for a while the Nation of Islam was the largest Muslim movement in the United States. Uh, in many ways, I think even Sunni Muslims will tell you they sort of opened the door for the acceptability of Islam in the U.S. Most of the older Black Muslims, even when they're not sort of Nation of Islam anymore, first had exposure to Islam through the Nation of Islam and things like that. So, but when people from the Middle East started finding out what was going on, they always had sort of this kind of opportunistic thing, well, kind of love hate relationship with the
Mm.
Nation of Islam. So Malcolm went over there originally. I know he went to Egypt at the very least in the late 1950s, and there was supposed to be a fatwa out on Elijah Muhammad and stuff like that. Um, he ended up going. So that wasn't the first time Malcolm had traveled internationally, but he did end up traveling again in the early 1960s. And I forget the question exactly, but I think that you were basically asking me about, his connections to the OAAU
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
stuff like that, and Fidel and stuff like that. Well, um, the Cuban Revolution is finalized January 1st, 1959. In 1960, that is referred to as the Year of Africa. And that year, something like almost 20 African nations got independence, uh, including the Congo. So it was what so many people saw was maybe a pivotal year, maybe a shining year of examples. Right, 3 years before, uh, 3 years before, Ghana had gotten independence and things like that, and it really sort of set off this sort of decolonizing moment. And that's the moment in which Malcolm emerges, right? I think it's important to place Malcolm's emergence on the world stage in this moment of decolonization that's happening. Well, what happens is in 1960, Cuba came to the um, it was the UN General Assembly, but instead of sitting at the Waldorf Astoria downtown,
Right.
they instead stayed uptown
Yeah.
at the Hotel Teresa. So that's when they first were making connections. But it's also evidence if you go to there's some other things you can check out, but there's evidence that Malcolm was interacting with Che um,
Yes.
uh, 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 around the time that he died, because Che and Malcolm wanted to create basically a foreign service unit, right? Something like that hadn't really been done since the Spanish Civil War, organized black people from the diaspora and have them go over into the Congo and fight against the colonial powers over in the Congo. That's connected to the speech, that Malcolm gives, in which he says, what was it, the Valor of the Bullet, when he says, we need a Mau Mau in Harlem. He says,
Yes. Yes.
we need a. So that's pretty much what he was
Hmm.
thinking about. So Malcolm was an anti-colonial person. He emerged on the stage at the moment of anti-colonial struggle. Yeah, and what sets him apart really is he really uh, uh, united with and believed in the struggles of the African working class.
Definitely. Yeah. And he definitely united with Fidel Castro. Well, Castro being part of that. One of the things, if you go to Cuba, they actually have monuments to the Cuban soldiers who had went to support Angola, and they're very, very proud of that. Went to support Angola when South Africa was waging a war of aggression against Angolan interests, and of course Che fighting a year. I think it was what year that he went to the Congo, and and um,
Yeah, like
and
64.
something like
I
that.
think I think it was around 64. There was something called the Simba Rebellion
Yeah, yeah.
in the middle of what they called the Congo Crisis.
Hmm.
And yeah, so that was the real first effort to really organize people
Yeah.
over there. Yeah.
Yeah, that answers the question because I was thinking about the UN as a stage for sort of a human rights sort of tribunal or addressing civil rights, and wondering, how that would be any more effective than appealing to the United States government, because it's largely the United States and Western powers who have a lot of control over where resources go, have the sort of organization and the militancy within these various countries and can act in solidarity. Um, Again, that it kind of fits with his ideology and ballot of the bullet. Um, The other thing that strikes me,
Right.
well, yeah, go
And
ahead.
I think it's also important just quickly to note that Malcolm wasn't I mean, he didn't place any faith in the UN, neither do we, right? I mean, the irony, the contradiction with this moment of, and I say decolonization and air bubbles because I see this person here says, how are African countries independent when they are paying extortion taxes to European countries? Yeah, I mean, they're not independent, right? So basically, the contradiction is that that sort of colonialism is replaced with what Kwame Nkrumah called neo-colonial.
Hmm.
So it's that neo-colonialism, in which Malcolm was seeking to raise an army and send the
Exactly. Yeah.
army into the Congo and fight
Hmm.
against neo-colonial Africa. And neo-colonialism through African internationalism is basically, in short, described as black power, white power, and blackface, right? So,
Right.
yeah. So, in that, and also once again, Africa can't truly be free until the colonial borders are removed and power is placed into the hands of the working class, and Africans control all of their resources. They don't, and what you have right now is you basically have a proxy war between China and other nations over African resources, um, and stuff like that. So,
Yeah.
so
Interesting.
yeah, you're
Yeah.
absolutely correct.
Yeah. The other thing that strikes me just about the title of that speech is, I think at that time, if I'm not mistaken, he was organizing a voter drive in Harlem, and telling people to get registered, not to register as Republican or Democrat, but just to register. That's the other thing about the Alex Haley sort of version of events. It doesn't really talk about, one would get the impression that Malcolm X left the Nation of Islam, which may or may not be true, but it wasn't a stated reason. That over the personal improprieties of Elijah Muhammad, the affairs that he had, and that certainly was a factor. But that wasn't the reason he stated for leaving the Nation of Islam. Being an apolitical organization, he felt constrained that he couldn't
Mhm.
pursue a political agenda. Um, and he only mentioned the affairs when, around the time it was right, I think it was right before his house was firebombed.
Mhm.
And you have to wonder how much of that, because that a lot of this has culminated, and we know now from the COINTELPRO documents that the FBI was not only feeding information to Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X, but also to the media and feeding a story. Um, the real departure with Malcolm is that he came back with a political agenda, and took that political agenda on a local and an international level. Um, where do you see given that the Nation of Islam wasn't a particularly was a it was an apolitical organization. It outed itself, religious organization, not a political organ. Um, what's your assessment of where Malcolm got his political vision and his internationalism?
Well, I'll begin closer to his departure from the nation and then move backwards, right? So one thing that I think is important is to think about is the 1962 killing of Ronald Stokes under the hands of the Los Angeles Police Department, right? So I mean, this is over 3 years before the Watts Rebellion, and I think that Malcolm was energized as well through his trips to California, very well received by the working class out here. Also, when Stokes was killed, Malcolm was told not to respond, not to act, um, even though that's not the way in which they were trained, right? So um, So I mean, you got that new documentary that I think raises some good contradictions about that moment, right? Really, in which they the financial endeavors of the nation, I guess. The documentary suggests sort of sort of raise the political contradictions and things like that. But nevertheless, it's very clear that Malcolm was very serious, is very dedicated towards African liberation and liberation of his people. He lived a very modest lifestyle as well, and really until um, his last days, didn't really act out of discipline in his public remarks about Elijah Muhammad. So to me,
Right,
this is
exactly.
very crucial because it shows, like I said, the lineage and the discipline of Malcolm. Right. So if he didn't get his seriousness, his radicalism, just by being in the nation. Then where he got it from his parents and his older sister, right? So his mom and his dad, Earl, and what's his mom's name, Louise,
Luis, yeah.
and were organizers for the Universal Negro Improvement Association. They actually met in Canada, where a lot of black expatriates from the U.S. as well as migrants from the Caribbean and Africa were. There were large collectives over in Ontario, over in Nova Scotia, over in Quebec as well, where I think his parents actually met as organizers there. Some of his siblings were even born in Canada. So his mother was the secretary. When they moved back to Omaha, Nebraska, his mother was the secretary of the UNIA, and his dad was the president of the UNIA chapter. I mean, all these things are kind of talked about in the film and even the book and stuff like that, but they're really sort of downplayed
Right.
because I think that sort of see the way in which Malcolm's book is actually written is sort of like Siddhartha come to Jesus moment type
Yes.
thing. Uh, um, and it's not just about his book. The truth is that a lot of books that seek to tell the story of movement activism, going all the way back to the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, really talk about how what like socialists would call the movement from false consciousness to consciousness, right? So in that sort of basically the past is going to be seen as like, oh, that's when I was sort of like dark and dumb and blind, and now that I've come to light. This is how I become the person I am today. However, there's other historians that I use in my classes, like Robin Kelly, who
Mm,
says, "Hey, we need to go and look back at those early moments, the moments of Malcolm Little and
yeah.
Detroit Red, and see the origins of his politics there." So his parents were UNIA activists. His older sisters and them were already involved, and then he had an older brother who was already in the Nation of Islam before he even had gone to prison. Right. So they act like he was in his cell and he never heard about the Nation of Islam. That's not true. He already knew about the nation. And then also, I think it's important for us to consider his moment even as a Zoot suiter, in the sense that he sort of chose to actively resist uh, uh, wartime American part- culture, economy, participation, and stuff like that. He was brought in front of the 4-H. He was brought in front of the um, induction board, and he was
Mm,
given a screening interview. And he said he conked his hair, he put on a bright suit, he went over there, he was talking jive to the guy, and the guy asked him why you want to go to join the army, and he says because he wanted to go down south and get some guns,
right.
organize inward soldiers, and kill and shoot white people. And he says the guy shakingly drops his blue pen, picks up his red pen, and then a couple weeks later, he wasn't surprised when he received his 4F card, which basically means that he was unfit for military service. Well, even after about a decade later, Malcolm also rejected registering for the draft in the Korean War, right? So we can really see this long sort of history of internationalism of Malcolm is what made him who he was, um, and even undoubtedly made him a political threat as well.
I was reading up a little bit on his mother. She was a very, the thing that that really does her a disservice in the film, like you said, is it basically portrayed her as a mother, domestic, and basically cracked under um, was mentally ill. But politically, she was hugely influential. She was very active in Omaha, and had traveled. I think her parents, or she was originally from Grenada, if I'm not if I'm not
Grenada.
mistaken. And so it really kind of downplays the importance of Weiss Little, and I don't know whether to attribute that to sort of the narrative that Alex Haley wanted to frame in terms of this person growing up from humble beginnings and going through all these trials and tribulations and becoming out a better person. I think that was what driving the narrative. Even though he had, like as you said, he had these all along, and it was just a matter of refining and honing. And that's one of the things I respect about Malcolm.
Yeah,
Always
a sort
refining
of
and honing.
Horatio Alger story, right?
Yeah,
How can we write Malcolm into the traditional story of American heroes?
sure. Yeah, I don't know if it's that or if it's this sort of patriarchal thing.
Oh yeah, that too, right?
Yeah, interesting.
I
I
mean, because
think,
they rarely talk about his sister, and his sister
yeah,
really
that's
became sort of
true.
like a motherly figure. And even if he didn't remember the stuff through his own parents, it's his sister who sort of talked about him. And his sister was deeply involved in, say, the Garveyist tradition.
Hmm. Hmm.
She had joined the UNIA. She was deeply involved in African spirituality and stuff like that. So she really talks about Malcolm X as being the one, and everyone in the
Hmm.
family knew that he was going to be the one.
Sure.
That, so so I saw earlier this year an amazing interview with his sister, um, which was Ella, which, like I said, which undoubtedly was a motherly figure to him, but in the sense that, like, she would have been, she didn't, she kind of, she realized when he made certain pivots in his life that he wasn't going to live a long time like his dad. But yeah, so I think his mother and his sister, as well as the legacy of his father, the teachings of his father, were absolutely crucial. Lastly, there was also a guy named Carlos Cook.
Mm.
Carlos Cooks was a Dominican Republic born African person. His parents had been from the English speaking West Indies. He was born in the Dominican Republic, moved to the Harlem, and he was a younger person in the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Community League, in the military wing of it. So even after the passing of Garvey, the deportation and passing of Garvey, Carlos Cooks led the Garveyite movement into the 1950s and 60s, having at his feet also Malcolm. So he played an important. Carlos Cooks played
Hmm.
an important role
Yeah.
as well. He had an organization called the African Pioneers Movement. I think he died around 1967 or 68 or something like that. After he passed away, you kind of see sort of like a splintering in the sort of African independence movement here in the U.S. But but yeah, yeah, yeah. Carlos Cook as well.
Mhm.
So Malcolm was deeply steeped in the history of Marcus Garvey,
Yeah.
um, who whom our movement holds up high.
Sure. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about Marcus Garvey? Before you do that, though, I just want to remind folks we've got about 20 minutes left, and we do want to make this sort of an interactive give and take. Super chats are enabled. I've just already gotten notified that the video is going to be demonetized in terms of ads because it's not suitable for advertising.
Uh,
Yeah.
oh
But
man, that's crazy.
the super chats are enabled. And again, really it's your support if you find this valuable and want to support instructors
So
who
did we
really
say
should
something
have
wrong?
well, I'm gonna appeal it, but I wasn't expecting to get much anyway.
Oh, okay.
Really it's about people power, and there's any folks who want to contribute $1, $5, again, we'll answer your questions live. And really, it's about keeping people in the discipline. It's hard to stay in the discipline when you can't, when you can't get steady work. So that's what we're at African Elements. We're trying to create some of those opportunities for some really super talented folks, um, and keep them in the discipline. So we got. I wanted to keep about 20 minutes. It's about 12 after now, and I don't see many questions. Hopefully, we'll get some super chats, folks who want to contribute, and again, we'll answer those questions live. But can you talk about Garveyism? Most people know Garvey for the Back to Africa movement, and not much else. And interesting thing about, well, I'll let you talk on that. How does Garvey fit into this internationalist framework?
Our side is Garvey. So yeah, Garvey says first and foremost, Africa for Africans at
Hmm.
home and abroad. He understood the need to eradicate the colonial borders in Africa. That all African people, regardless of whether they were born or African, and have the birthright to return to Africa. Um, he had an ideology which he called African fundamentalism, which eventually sought to um, uh, uh, uplift and liberate all African people. And what's most importantly is not just about Garvey himself, but about the people. Well, first off, Garvey was born very poor in Jamaica, lost most of his family before he was even a teenager because of disease and sickness. Um, uh, 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 but like most people, he begins to travel. As he travels, he realizes that the conditions under which he lives are universal conditions for African people. He lived in Central America. He'd come to the American South. He'd read up from slavery. All of these things really understandingly, really understanding himself that that the only way forward for African people is unity, collective struggle, overturning of colonialism, putting Africa into the hands of the of African people. Also, Garvey believed in self-determination
Yes,
and
yes.
building dual power, right? So he built multiple institutions, newspaper companies, shipping companies, storefronts. They had theater troops. They had all sorts of things with his movement and underneath his leadership. So Garvey really influences African internationalism. An important thing too is Garvey was opposed to the elitism of the of the mainstream civil rights movement and of Du Bois and others who were, I guess they would have called, for lack of a better term, color struck. Um, yeah, yeah,
Well, I remember he referred to the National Association of NAACP, the National Association uh, for the Advancement of Certain People,
right.
and he had a point. He had a point on that.
Right,
Um,
right, right, right. And uh, what's his name? Du Bois said, he was short and black, but with intelligent eyes, or something
yeah,
like that. And
they got and yeah,
like
yeah, it was ugly.
and a lot of real nasty stuff.
Yeah.
Du
Philip Randolph
Bois.
referred to him as that supreme Jamaican jackass.
Right,
They
right,
were,
and Randolph, Du Bois, Cyril Briggs
yeah,
worked with the powers that be to undercut his movement. But
yeah,
nevertheless, like I said, the thing is that over 12 million African people internationally, the largest movement
yes, yes,
of any kind, I would argue, of any kind, especially that had not controlled actual state power,
hmm
um, uh, uh, was was the masses chose him. I mean, from here to Kenya, over to Central America, not just black people in Central America, but even indigenous revolutionaries in Central America, like Sandino. Garvey's paper was the political organ for his revolution in Nicaragua in the 1920s. I mean, Garvey was an absolutely a crucial person. He says, up you might erase, yeah, so that is Garvey. I mean, whether contradictions, yes, we seek to overturn those contradictions with African internationalism, but nevertheless, the people chose him, and I think that's what really sort of upset and frustrated the other people. Oftentimes books put Garvey as an anti-socialist. He wasn't an anti-socialist. He just didn't trust the white socialists in the United States. I mean, if you look at his writings, there's one where he basically says, and I mean, he's a funny guy too, right? So, like, I mean, uh, uh, there's one speech where he says, he basically feels that, like, white socialists want black people to be socialists so that when the white people come to fire people for being socialists at the job, that they'll fire the black people, you know. So, so, so I mean, he calls socialism as sort of trying to have black people be equal to the lowest rung of whites and all sorts of stuff, But it's like, I mean, it's a time in which a lynching was happening every other day in the U.S., man. King Leopold, the Belgians in the Congo killed what they say a conservative estimate is 15 million people. A conservative estimate or something like that is 15 million people that they killed. That's not including Namibia and the British in India and Australia and all other places where you had these violence taking place. So that was the context under him. That's also the context that produced Malcolm X.
oh, sure.
Uh, yeah, yeah. And I think that the promise of his OAAU is the fact that it actually even was even more radical than our Organization of Africans. Right.
So, so,
Because I mean, with the exception of Nkrumah, we think about people like Haile Selassie, who very opportunistically, used notions of African unity for his own gain. And also, African internationalism is about uplifting and putting power into the hands of the African working class, right? And none of those nations had been movements happen where the actual African working class took power. What happened was that the African middle class, petty bourgeoisie, whatever you want to call them, are the ones who took power in those movements. And at the moment that the leaders move to rectify their contradictions and become more in unity with the workers, people like Patrice Lumumba, people like Kwame Nkrumah, they were assassinated, they were overthrown and died in exile, things like that, right? Whereas the other nations, where you have people either more specifically like and sort of overtly like Mobutu, or more say much more less overtly like Kenneth Kaunda and Julius Nyerere. Sort of they'll use Pan African principles and things like that to because they know that the masses are really interested in these principles, but at the same time, the principles weren't like they didn't have in place a process to actually give power to the working class. I mean, actually, when the working class did rise up, right, they threw people in jail, ostracized people and things like that. I mean, even in yeah, so yeah, that's what I would say. Um, uh, as well.
And
Malcolm was very close with, uh, even before he had left the nation, he had already been making political bonds with socialist activists over in Detroit. So in 1963, that whole message to the grassroots conference where he spoke, I forget the name of the church now, but he was very close with a guy named Reverend Clee, who was the pastor at the Shrine of the Black Madonna, a sort of Pan African Christian church over in Detroit. And he was brought up there, and then he spoke at a conference. The conference was put on by some people such as James Boggs, Grace Lee Boggs,
yeah, yeah,
and that's where Malcolm gives the message to the grassroots, really
yeah.
as a revolutionary reaction to the March on Washington,
Mm.
right? In which Malcolm, like I said, say so so Terminal Mali Yeshitela talks about the civil rights movement being a movement from above, right? It's a movement from
Definitely, yeah.
above in which the middle class people are
Hmm.
making change. That change that they're trying to institute during the civil rights movement, was to make America a better place, right? But the lesson of Malcolm is that Malcolm was not trying to say make America and Americans a better place. He was trying to make the world a better place for African people,
Yeah.
and understood the need for self government for African people. And I think that's one of the questions we were going to have, right? But I think that it's undoubtedly through this struggle, right, through this sort of polemic that he had with Dr. King, that it sort of sharpened Dr. King's own internationalism as
Definitely.
well.
Yeah.
Now, Dr. King in '57 had actually gone to Ghana. He was at the independence ceremony.
Right,
So, so,
right.
so when so when you read some of Dr. King's stuff, and later on that year in '57, he came to Russ Auditorium over here in San Diego at San Diego High School, and he gave a public speech at Russ Auditorium in which he basically underscored the fact that black people were a part of a global majority. So you could tell that Dr. King was closely following international events as well, but his strategy was still at first a nation-based anti-racist strategy of gaining equality with the oppressors here within the United States, in which that was not Malcolm's strategy, right? He didn't outline. He said, what good is it to integrate into a burning house? And then you see Dr. King, by the time they assassinate Dr. King, saying the exact same thing, right? That, like, he fears that he had led his people into a burning house. Um, sort of Dr. King began to attack the power structure internationally by looking at the international effects of the power structure and stuff like by asking about the military industrial complex, by seeking to organize the poor people's campaign and stuff like that. Because Dr. King was a mobilizer, but he actually was not really an organizer
No,
in
right.
that sense, right? At least in the movement. In African internationalism, traditionally mobilization tends to be single issue politics, through which you rally people for a single objective, right? But when the SCLC came into town, they didn't leave anything as their legacy, right? Except for maybe some reforms. You can't say, okay, the SCLC built that school right there. You know what I
Yes,
mean?
yes.
The SCLC got us all pay raises, or something like that. So they mobilized. So you got progressive people like Dr. King who were great mobilizers, but as Kwame Nkrumah says, they weren't necessarily, as Kwame Ture says, they weren't necessarily great organizers. The legacy of Malcolm, the legacy of Marcus Garvey, the legacy of the Huru movement and Omali Shatella will be of organizers, right? You can point towards institutions where you say, okay, those institutions were created by political struggle and for the people, and that's how power is going to be built. So yeah. Hopefully, I hit on some important points. Are there any other
Yeah,
points that we can make
yeah.
real
There was
quick?
a lot. There was a lot that you hit on. You were. Uh, I think one of the things that I think is needs to be looked at more is his relationship with Queen Mother Moore, Malcolm X's
Mm-hmm.
relationship with Queen Mother Moore, and personally, because one of the things about Garvey is that he was also a
She was a
very
Garveyite.
she was a Garveyite, but she also was affiliated with the Communist Party,
Mm-hmm.
which is again a economically kind of opposed Garvey being a sort of entrepreneurial. We need black businesses and black communities. And am I wrong about that? It seems like as well as his mother, Louise, being very Garveyite, but also threading that walking that tightrope between Garveyism and economic philosophy slash capitalism. Um, and um, and I'm wondering if those are the links that shaped Malcolm more worker oriented grassroots approach.
Um. Well. It's important to know first and foremost when Garvey began to when the Bolshevik Revolution happened, Garvey sent congratulations to Lenin and Trotsky.
I'm sorry,
Right?
I don't want to cut you off. I just noticed we did have a question, and I know you have to go to
Yeah, yeah.
another meeting. Maybe we can circle back to that. But it's a good question. Is it realistic to think that people outside of Africa, like Malcolm or Garvey, can help Africa colonialism? Excellent question.
Yeah, because colonialism is an international system, and it can't be overthrown without the connection between Africans in Africa and Africans that live at the center of colonialism in the belly of the beast.
Hmm.
I mean, Garvey understood that, and Nkrumah understood that. Amilcar Cabral understood that. Sankara understood that, and Omali Estella understands that, right?
Yeah.
So like that's central to African internationalism. That it has to be the unity of both, right? African people all around the world. So is it realistic? Well, I mean, just go look. The borders in Africa are false. the flags, the names, all that stuff. But I mean, it's the reason why so many of those flags got red, black, or green, or all three of them inside their flags, right? It's the reason why
Mhm.
Malcolm still to this day is an extremely recognizable figure on the continent. So yeah, I mean, can it? I think your answer is too generous in the sense that yes, right, that they can help Africa rise up. Of course, yeah, without a doubt. The teachings have been proven, right? That's why they were all overthrown and persecuted and stuff like that. But yeah, because the basic principles are, Africa unite, power in the hands of the masses of African people, overturn colonialism and capital. That is the idea. So yeah, I would say yes. Um, I mean, I would say that's the only way forward. I mean, we've had 60 years of neo-colonialism in Africa, in which these sort of independent nation state struggles, even if they are sort of led by revolutionaries, have not achieved the complete independence for Africa and stuff like that. So yeah, yeah. But yeah, going back to the other thing, yeah, Malcolm was a socialist. Malcolm identified with socialists. Garvey, I mean, Garvey was a trade unionist. Garvey had some early doings with socialists and communists in the U.S. Garvey's movement was older than the Communist Party, the Workers' Party, as it was called at that time. So when you see the sort of basically when the CP couldn't put people in there and completely take over Garvey's movement, that's when you begin to see the friction. Because that friction don't really happen. You don't really see the friction until like 1921. It's important to know that, right? It's at least 3-4 years in which Cyril Briggs and others are at least nominally in support of the UNIA. Uh, so it's not about. I mean, we don't have evidence of him fighting against African socialists at the time, at least African socialist organizations that weren't trying to overthrow him. I think that we have to contextualize it, the opposition to Garvey, and his opposition to socialism as opposition to the opportunism of the Communist Party within the United States at that time, as it sought to expand. And because what happens is, after he after his movement is basically defeated and he's deported, um, they uh, they take up his ideas, but then they take up his ideas and sort of they minimize them to being just about the liberation of black people in the U.S. with that whole black belt thesis, as opposed to sort of the global unified liberation of African people. They never sort of assess the parasitic relationship that the white working class had with even the black working class. Du Bois begins to talk about that sort of stuff in the 30s with Black Reconstruction, but it's Du Bois who kind of helped defeat Garvey. You
Right.
know,
With the
but you can't really. His ideas still have not been defeated, right? 100 years later, at least his ideas live on. And Malcolm was one person through which Garvey's ideas lived through. So this Saturday, or actually Monday, is what we call African Liberation Day.
yes, I'm glad you
So
mentioned that.
Monday is African Liberation Day. This weekend, there's African Liberation Day Festival. If you go to alduhuru.org, you can log on and view the African Liberation Day a webinar that's going to take place on Saturday and Sunday. And if you go to, but yeah, so back in the 70s and 80s, this really used to be a whole week of say black liberation, especially during the time of the anti-apartheid movement on college campuses and elsewhere in the community at parks. It was a week-long festival in Long Beach. They used to have what's called the Black Consciousness Festival and stuff like that. Really spanning week between Malcolm's birthday on the 19th and African Liberation Day on the 25th. Oh,
and not and oh yeah,
one last thing. Malcolm also helped organize a union of nurses, black
right,
and Puerto Rican nurses, right?
yeah.
So people, like I said, all
When
that
was
stuff
that?
is left out. I got the picture somewhere. I'll share it with you, but it was in like that either in Brooklyn or Queens. It was in a
Mhm.
hospital. I forget the local. It was the AFL-CIO local. I can try to. I'll pull it up while I'm talking to you on it. I'm not going to share the screen just yet, but yeah, I do have the image in which he organized a he organized it. And the one last thing I say about Malcolm that made Malcolm such an important figure to Black thought at this time is the fact that um, Malcolm organized and ran the Mr. Muhammad Speaks newspaper. And if you look at Muhammad Speaks, the interesting thing is that the only real actual um, religious aspect of the Muhammad Speaks newspaper was actually was actually the here it is was actually um, uh, um, what do you call it? Um, the address by Elijah Muhammad. I mean, the rest of the newspaper actually was an organ for African international news and liberation and political struggles and stuff like that. And Malcolm was behind that. And I forget who it was, but there was even one of the editors of Muhammad Speaks was a person. So it was the I have found it, and it is the it was January 1963. AFL-CIO. It was Negro and Puerto Rican Community Support. Local 1199. Um, fight against exploitation at the hospital.
Wow.
So he basically he was fighting for hospital workers, union rights. So I mean, and we think about even this COVID-19 crisis, right? You know,
Yeah.
so you know,
Wow. So I know you have to run to another Impedum event. Speaking of Impedum, just another reminder that will be a Burning Spear study group tomorrow, 6 p.m. Pacific. Check out the Burning Spear virtual study group on the Facebook group, and we'll be doing a live discussion on uh, some some selected articles. Always a really good discussion. Yeah, I always get a lot out of those. I really appreciate you, people scholar.
thank you.
I appreciate that about you.
As are you. I mean, at this time, I would just mainly say, like, if you're out there, you're a teacher, you're trying to get better at what you're doing. We don't know how long we'll be doing this remote lecturing, this online lecturing. I think most of the classes are distance education, but now you got the remote lecturing. I mean, the resources coming out of African Elements, the lectures, the sort of discussion board formats, and all that stuff that Darius has put together over the last 15 years plus. Really, before anybody else was doing this stuff, it really allows for you and African Elements to be a value towards the teaching of Black studies. And I think the most important thing is that, like, what makes a person a teacher isn't sort of, the credentials they get through colonial education, right? It's the value and the leadership that they have with the community, right? So, so if anything, the thing that I really have always valued was the ability to bring the stuff that I learned in the universities back to the community stuff that you and I do for
Yes.
not a dime,
Yes.
right? For not a dime.
Give it to the
So
people.
yeah,
That's what it's all about. And you really,
exactly.
yeah, you make me want to up my game. So appreciate
Oh
you for
man,
that.
hey, same with you.
Uh,
Look at you, man. Look at this. You made me a better online teacher.
appreciate it. So we didn't get any super chats today, which is okay. I mean, again, this is about the people. It's not
Yeah, it's all
about.
right. It's the first
But
one.
you can support by just sharing, liking, subscribing. We have a few Patreon subscribers. Patreon subscribers do get access to ad-free videos, so that you can embed those into your classes or check them out without the ads as well. A lot of resources that I've collected over the years that you get with that subscription. Again, I want to make it as easy as possible for folks to stay in the discipline. And, especially if they're just starting out, it takes time to accumulate all that stuff. So, why start from scratch? I think really it should be on the folks who have been doing this for a while to say, here, take my stuff and build on it. And
Right.
yeah, so again, it just kind of starts with I just appreciate all the viewers, all the subscribers. Thank you so much for watching. I'll be back next week. I'm going to talk about California borders next week. Why the
Okay.
border is where um, Alta California extended to the Rockies, but we have
Oh
a border.
wow, that's gonna be good.
We have a border where it is. Like, well, how did that happen? Slavery was really at the. Again, thank you. I'll be back next week, same time. We'll be talking about California border and why it is where it is, and that's kind of getting into 3:18. I'll catch up with you. I'll definitely see you tomorrow on the Burning Spear. Everybody, check out the Burning Spear at Burning Spear Reading Group at Facebook. Check it out. It's gonna be. Can't wait to see.
Oh yeah. I posted them up there, so I still got to get those discussion questions out there. But yeah, it's gonna be great.
Thank you so much, and
No problem. Thank you.
Matsemela, it's been a pleasure. This is our
Oh no
first
problem.
our
Thank you.
first stream, so hopefully it'll be the first of many. We'll build on this, and thank you again for all the folks for watching,
Okay.
subscribing.
Yeah. The person commenting, Monster or something like that, whoever that is, that asked all those questions. Thank you very much. It
Yeah,
was an honor.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Great questions. I really appreciate that. So I'll see you next
Okay.
week. I will see
I'll
you,
talk to you soon.
Matsemela, tomorrow, and take
All right.
care. Thanks again.